The entire story of Darth Plagueis. 2. Fall asleep. 2. In the vastness of the galaxy, where stars burn for billions of years and civilizations rise and fall like waves upon an endless sea, there are stories that survive not in the monuments of stone or the archives of senators, but in whispers carried quietly from one age to the next. And among these whispers, none is more haunting than the tale of Darth Plagueis the Wise, a Sith Lord who believed he could conquer death itself. His name does not echo in the great halls of the Senate, nor in the shining records of the Jedi, for the victors of history wrote him out, erasing his presence until he remained only in myth. And yet his shadow stretches long, his influence threading through the events that brought about the fall of the Republic and the birth of an empire. Tonight, as you listen, you do not hear the tale of a conqueror clad in armor or a warrior who raised fleets, but of a figure who moved in silence, who wielded not only a blade of crimson, but the subtler weapons of knowledge, wealth, and patience, and whose tragedy was not that he lacked power, but that he sought power so absolute he became blind to the one truth the galaxy always repeats, that no being can ever control everything, not even life and death. The galaxy has always been shaped by the duel between light and shadow, Jedi and Sith, each age adding its own verses to the same eternal song. And in this, Plagueis was both a continuation and an exception, for while most Sith reveled in chaos, passion, and conquest, he was methodical, clinical, a thinker cloaked in patience, a moon whose long, elongated features mirrored the cold calculations of his mind, a being who moved not with fiery speeches, but with numbers, with credits, with experiments, his mask of respectability as Hego Damask, banker and financier, hiding the darker truth that he was the apprentice of Darth Tenebrous and later master to Darth Sidious, the one who would eclipse him. But before he became legend, he was a living presence, bound to a species of traders and bankers, schooled in secrecy, raised in halls where wealth mattered as much as wisdom, and from the beginning he carried with him the sense that survival and dominance could not come through strength of arms alone, but through control of the very threads of existence itself. To hear his story is to drift slowly through the long corridors of Sith history, past tombs lit by torches on Korriban, past the ruins of empires shattered and reborn, to a quieter chamber, a place where one man bent his life to unlocking the mysteries of the Force, not only for destruction, but for creation, believing he could command the midi-chlorians themselves. The microscopic symphony through which life flowed, and in doing so elevate himself to something greater than any Jedi or Sith before him. And yet, as with all who seek too much, his reach exceeded his grasp. And though his experiments shook the fabric of the Force, though he touched the edges of secrets forbidden to even the wisest, he could not escape the fate that awaits every Sith bound by the rule of two, the betrayal of his apprentice, the moment when master becomes victim, and the cycle continues. Still, what makes his tale soothing in its own way is that it reminds us that power is fragile, that even those who seem invincible can fall in an instant, that eternity belongs not to those who try to command it, but to the stories told afterward. And in this sense, Plagueis achieved immortality after all, not through experiments or control, but through the soft, lingering echo of his name, remembered in a tale told once to a young Jedi named Anakin Skywalker, a tale that shaped the destiny of galaxies. So let yourself rest as you drift into his story now. for you are not about to walk into the roar of armies or the blaze of fleets, but into the quiet chambers of thought and shadow, where a Muun Sith Lord sat in meditation, his eyes closed, his mind whispering to the very essence of life, believing he could shape it forever. Never knowing that his true eternity would be found not in life preserved, but in legend whispered, a whisper of the dark, carried softly across the stars. Long before the name Darth Plagueis was whispered in fear, long before the galaxy knew of Hego Damask, there was the lineage of his people, the Moons of Scipio, a species unlike any other, tall and elongated, with narrow faces, pale skin, and deliberate voices. A people who had built their reputation not upon conquest or artistry, but upon wealth, mathematics, and the quiet mastery of finance. For where other civilizations looked to fleets or temples for power, the Moons understood that true dominance lay in numbers, in ledgers, in contracts and credit flows that could bind entire star systems tighter than chains. Their world of Scipio was cold and mountainous, its crags and plateaus carved into towering citadels of stone and metal, where the great families of the intergalactic banking clan ruled as monarchs not of blood, but of balance sheets, their houses competing endlessly yet quietly, not with swords but with calculations, each Moon trained from childhood to think in terms of profit, leverage, and long vision, their lifespan stretching long enough to let them plan not for decades, but for centuries. The Moons valued precision, their tall forms and narrow heads a symbol of their pursuit of clarity and control, and their reputation across the galaxy was one of both respect and resentment, for the Republic depended upon their credits to fund wars and projects, yet despised their cold detachment, seeing in them a people who had little care for art, for music, for beauty, only for accumulation, only for stability measured in ledgers and reserves. But for the Moons themselves, this was identity, their philosophy a kind of faith. For they believed that through wealth came influence, and through influence came security, and that through patience a species could outlast empires, standing tall while others burned and fell. It was into this world that Hego Damask, Darth Plagueis, was born, his family of high station within the banking clan, ensuring that from his earliest days he breathed the cold air of ambition, taught to see every transaction as a move in a larger game, taught that survival was not about strength of arms but about mastery of perception, leverage, and unseen pressure. And yet within him stirred something deeper. For while most Moons were content to measure lives in profits, he was drawn to questions older and more dangerous, the rhythm of life and death, the way the Force itself could be bent not by credits but by will, and in this hunger he reflected the oldest contradictions of his species. For the Moons were both fragile and enduring, their thin bodies vulnerable to violence, yet their patience making them almost eternal in influence. The galaxy often mocked their appearance, called them gaunt or ghost-like, but behind those long faces lay minds sharper than blades, minds that had guided the rise and fall of governments without ever lifting a blaster. And it was this tradition of subtle power that shaped Hego Damask into the figure who would later wear the mask of Plagueis the Wise. To understand him is to understand the soil in which he was planted, a people who built temples not of stone, but of contracts, who believed in immortality, not of flesh, but of legacy. Who saw credits flow like the lifeblood of civilizations, and who knew that the galaxy, no matter how proud, always bent in the end to those who held its debts. And so, when the rule of two carried the torch of the Sith into this era, it was inevitable that a Muun would seize it, inevitable that one of their kind, with their patience and their cold detachment, would see in the Sith's dream of dominion not chaos, but order, not fire, but structure. And from this marriage of Sith philosophy and Muun tradition came Plagueis, a Sith Lord who cloaked himself not in rage but in reason, who shaped the fate of the galaxy not by striking openly, but by moving wealth and influence like pieces across a board, and who believed in his very bones that death itself could be bargained with, calculated, and conquered, as if it were merely another ledger entry waiting to be balanced. And as you picture this now, let your thoughts drift to Scipio's icy peaks, its citadels rising high against silver skies, Moons walking in quiet corridors lined with marble and steel, their voices soft, their eyes always calculating, a people whose lives were built upon patience and numbers, and among them a child destined to become not merely a banker, not merely a Sith, but a figure whose legend would echo far beyond the halls of Scipio, a whisper of a Muun who sought eternity itself. To speak of Darth Plagueis before he was master is to speak of him as apprentice, for no Sith rises alone, each carrying the shadow of the one who came before. And for Hego Damask, that shadow was Darth Tenebrous, a Sith Lord of uncommon brilliance, a figure whose mind rivaled even that of the Moons in precision. For Tenebrous was not a creature of fire or fury, but of engineering and calculation, a master who saw the galaxy as equations to be solved, probabilities to be measured, outcomes to be predicted. The Bith were already known as mathematicians, musicians, and scientists, their bulbous heads and wide eyes lending themselves to deep concentration and long analysis. And Tenebrous carried this reputation to its most dangerous extreme, marrying the intellect of his species with the ruthlessness of the Sith, crafting plans that stretched not across years, but centuries, designs so meticulous that he claimed even chaos itself could be reduced to formula. Into this world of numbers and dark philosophy, Hego Damask was drawn. Chosen as apprentice not only for his potential in the Force, but for his Muun heritage, for Tenebrous believed that only through patience, wealth, and precision could the Sith truly rise again from the ashes of millennia of failure. And in his student, he found the qualities he sought: ambition without haste, intelligence without compassion, and a willingness to question even the most sacred of Sith traditions. The training was harsh, but not in the crude sense of physical torment, for Tenebrous had little interest in pain as a teaching tool, preferring instead to burden Plagueis with relentless mental trials, forcing him to master economics, politics, and biology as deeply as lightsaber combat or Sith sorcery, insisting that the true battlefield was not only the arena or the starship deck, but the boardroom and the laboratory, where one could bend entire populations with a single decision. Under Tenebrous, Plagueis learned to cloak himself as Hego Damask, financier and investor, a man who could walk among senators and governors unnoticed, his power hidden not behind armor or armies, but behind contracts and investments. For Tenebrous believed that the future of the Sith lay not in endless war, but in the quiet strangling of the Republic through dependence on Sith-controlled institutions. Yet if Tenebrous was a visionary, he was also arrogant, convinced that his intellect freed him from the rule of two cycle, that he could calculate betrayal and prevent it, that he could shape an apprentice so perfectly that the pattern of master slain by pupil would end with him. And this arrogance was both his brilliance and his doom. For Plagueis, intelligence without compassion and a willingness to question even the most sacred of Sith traditions. The training was harsh, but not in the crude sense of physical torment, for Tenebrous had little interest in pain as a teaching tool, preferring instead to burden Plagueis with relentless mental trials, forcing him to master economics, politics, and biology as deeply as lightsaber combat or Sith sorcery, insisting that the true battlefield was not only the arena or the starship deck, but the boardroom and the laboratory, where one could bend entire populations with a single decision. Under Tenebrous, Plagueis learned to cloak himself as Hego Damask, negotiations that cloaked darker purposes, to tombs on Korriban, where they studied the failures of ancient lords, and at each step Tenebrous pressed his apprentice to think beyond passion, beyond rage, to wield the dark side as a scalpel rather than a hammer. And in this way, Hego Damask became Plagueis, a Sith unlike those before, not consumed by chaos, but by control, not lost to fire, but to cold precision. Yet in this relationship, the seeds of betrayal were always present, for the Sith are bound by it as much as they are bound by the Force itself. And though Tenebrous believed he could predict every possibility, though he trusted in equations and foresight, he underestimated the depth of his apprentice's ambition. For Plagueis was not content to remain forever in calculation. He wished to seize the ultimate truth mastery over life and death, control of the Force at its most fundamental level, and he knew that to pursue this fully, his master would one day have to fall. Still, in these years as apprentice, he absorbed every lesson, every philosophy, every technique, shaping himself into something more dangerous than Tenebrous had intended. For while the Bith Master believed he was creating a reflection of his own brilliance, what he was truly creating was the one who would surpass him, the one who would take his obsession with precision and carry it into realms even he had not dared to tread. And so, in the silence of laboratories, in the shadows of financial towers, in the long journeys through hyperspace where master and apprentice debated the nature of the Force as calmly as bankers might debate interest rates, Darth Plagueis was forged, not yet the legend, not yet the whisper told in hushed tones, but already the figure who would one day make even death seem negotiable. And as you let this chapter settle over you now, imagine the strange pair they made, the tall, narrow Muun and the bulbous-headed Beeth, walking together through archives and catacombs, their voices quiet but their intentions vast, plotting not battles, but centuries, not victories, but destinies. And in their bond lay both the promise of the Sith's rise and the inevitability of betrayal, a promise that no amount of calculation could erase, for in the end even the wisest cannot measure eternity. The apprenticeship of Hego Damask, now fully taken into the mantle of Darth Plagueis, was marked not by endless campaigns of conquest or parades of slaughter, but by long hours in laboratories, silent studies in hidden chambers, and nights filled with meditations that stretched beyond the edge of exhaustion. For what defined him above all was his obsession with the mysteries of life and death, mysteries that most Sith had brushed against in ritual or myth, but which Plagueis believed could be mapped, studied, and ultimately mastered like equations in a ledger. His earliest experiments began simply with the manipulation of tissue and cells, healing wounds that should not heal, extending the lives of small animals, altering patterns of growth. Yet even in these small trials, he saw hints of something greater, the shimmering truth that the midi-chlorians, those tiny symbionts that connected every living being to the Force, were not passive but responsive, not fixed but pliable, able to be coaxed or commanded to extend vitality, to resist decay, even to spark new life. And as this realization grew, his experiments became bolder, for he began to work not only with animals, but with sentient test subjects drawn from the fringes of society, prisoners, debtors, beings who would not be missed, their lives treated as raw material for his pursuit of immortality. To Plagueis, morality was nothing but a Jedi illusion, a chain that bound weaker minds to hesitation. And so he set it aside, caring only for what could be learned. For he told himself that if he could unlock the secret of eternal, mapped, studied, and ultimately mastered like equations in a ledger. His earliest experiments began simply with the manipulation of tissue and cells, healing wounds that should not heal, extending the lives of small animals, altering patterns of growth. Yet even in these small trials, he saw hints of something greater, the shimmering truth that the midi-chlorians, those tiny symbionts that connected every living being to the Force, were not passive but responsive, not fixed but pliable, able to be coaxed or commanded to extend vitality, to resist decay, even to spark new life. And as this realization grew, his experiments became bolder, for he began to work not only with animals, but with sentient, saw further than the Master, believing that the true flaw of the Sith across millennia had not been lack of power, but lack of permanence, that they rose and fell like flames because they could never escape mortality, never escape betrayal, never escape the simple truth that death always cut short their dominion. Thus, Plagueis dreamed of breaking the rule of two, not by rebellion, but by ending the need for succession altogether, by creating a dynasty of immortals where no apprentice would need to strike down a master, because the master would endure forever. And in this dream, he saw himself not only as a Sith Lord, but as the one who would rewrite the very destiny of the Force, ending the eternal cycle of rise and fall, bringing about a new order where death was no longer the final arbiter. His experiments grew darker, involving manipulation of bloodlines, alteration of pregnancies, and whispered legends would later claim that through his power he could create life itself. Though whether this was literal or symbolic, none could say, for the Sith always cloak truth in mystery, and Plagueis himself kept his greatest discoveries hidden even from his apprentice-to-be, believing that secrecy was the shield of wisdom. And yet for all his brilliance, there was also irony in his quest, for as he bent the Force to his will, he became increasingly blind to the subtler truths it whispered, blind to the way his obsession isolated him from the natural flow of life, blind to the inevitability that while he sought to conquer death, he could not conquer betrayal. That while he lengthened lifespans and prolonged vitality, he could not account for the simplest of human hunger's ambition. But in these years of study, he did not yet see that irony. He saw only progress, only potential, and his laboratories became temples of forbidden knowledge, filled with vials and instruments, with data records and ancient Sith holocrons, with the hum of machines that measured what could not be measured, while outside in the galaxy at large, he cloaked himself in the mask of Hego Damask, investor and banker, quietly building influence through credits even as he built mastery through science, always balancing two identities, the respectable financier and the dark alchemist. One hand in commerce and the other in creation. And so his lessons of death and experimentation continued, each day bringing him closer to what he believed was the threshold of godhood. Each night filled with the certainty that he was shaping not only his own destiny, but the destiny of the galaxy. For he told himself that if he could unlock the secrets of life itself, then the Republic, the Jedi, even the very Force would bend before him, and that at last the Sith would triumph not for a generation, but forever. And as you rest with this part of the story now, imagine the silent chambers where he worked rows of cold instruments glinting in faint light. Test subjects breathing shallowly under the weight of his experiments. Plagueis himself standing tall, his long moon face impassive, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the very essence of life flicker in his grasp, believing he could command it like a banker commands credits, never realizing that even in the stillness of those chambers, betrayal was already seeded, waiting only for time to bloom. The experiments of Darth Plagueis did not remain confined to hidden laboratories with test subjects taken from the fringes of society. For as his understanding of the Force deepened, he sought out knowledge from every corner of the galaxy, piecing together fragments of Sith sorcery, Jedi healing techniques, and the most obscure rituals preserved in forgotten tomes, determined to reduce mystery to method. To transform what had once been myth into repeatable science, and in this pursuit he traveled under the mask of Hego Damask, financier and philanthropist, quietly acquiring rare texts, sponsoring expeditions to ancient worlds, and gathering artifacts that others assumed were investments but which in truth were keys to secrets long buried. On Korriban, he studied the resonance of tombs where ancient lords had bound their spirits, noting how will alone could anchor consciousness beyond death. On Malachor, he felt the echoes of wounds so deep that they warped the living force itself, proof to him that destruction and creation were not opposites but two sides of the same coin. On obscure rim worlds, he funded medical research ostensibly for profit, but in reality to harvest discoveries about cell regeneration and the transfer of consciousness. Always the same goal drove him: that life could be manipulated like an equation, that death was not an end but a variable to be mastered. And though his methods were cold, there was brilliance in them, for he was the first Sith in generations to see midi-chlorians not as abstract whispers, but as instruments capable of being directed, capable of responding to deliberate will. And he trained himself to sense their fluctuations, to nudge them into rapid division, to slow their decline, to push them toward creation, until he could lengthen the life of a creature beyond its natural span, or hasten its death with a touch that seemed like nothing more than weariness. Yet with each success came greater obsession, for the taste of possibility was intoxicating, and soon he ceased to see other beings as independent lives, and saw them instead as experiments, as living fields upon which to test his theories. And he justified it with the reasoning that if he succeeded, if he truly conquered death, the sacrifice of a few would be eclipsed by the salvation of the Sith, who would never again be toppled by mortality. Still, there were moments when his work betrayed him, when an experiment spiraled out of control, when the surge of midi-chlorians created violent instability, producing agony rather than renewal. and in those failures he learned as much as in success, for he believed suffering was simply another data point, another step toward perfection. Tenebrous, his master, looked upon this with a mixture of disdain and cautious approval, seeing in his apprentice's obsession both a waste of time and a potential tool, for Tenebrous cared little for immortality. He sought control through prediction, through probability, and he often warned Plagueis that life was too chaotic to be reduced fully to numbers, that even midi-chlorians had their limits. But Plagueis ignored the warning, convinced that limits were illusions, convinced that with enough patience he would find the key, and in his meditations he began to imagine futures where the rule of two itself was broken, where he and his apprentice, once he chose one, could reign side by side without fear of betrayal, their lives stretched across centuries, their dynasty unending. This dream set him apart from other Sith, for while most embraced passion and power for the sake of domination, Plagueis believed he was building something eternal, something that would end the cycle forever. And this belief hardened into doctrine within his mind, a truth so certain that he no longer questioned its morality or its cost. And as the years passed, he began to sense ripples in the Force caused by his own manipulations, faint disturbances that told him he was close to unlocking the final secret. And though he could not yet fully preserve life indefinitely, he grew certain that he had brushed against the edge of creation itself, that he might be able to spark existence where none had been. And this possibility thrilled and terrified him, for to create life was to rival the Force itself. Yet even as he pushed into these forbidden realms, he grew careless in other ways, his confidence swelling, his arrogance deepening, his belief that he alone understood the truth, making him dismiss the dangers of ambition, both his own and that of others. And though he told himself he was eliminating the need for betrayal by rendering death irrelevant, he did not see that betrayal was not born only of fear of mortality, but of hunger for power, a hunger that no amount of immortality could erase. Still, in those years, his focus was unshaken, and he recorded his findings in secret, storing them in encrypted archives, whispering his thoughts into holocrons sealed in vaults no one else would ever find, convinced that if he died before achieving his dream, someone might continue his work, though he assured himself that he would never die, not truly, not once the final formula was found. And as you let this part of the story drift across you, imagine the cold laboratories lit by faint light, vials and instruments scattered across silent tables, Plagueis standing tall with his narrow moon face impassive, his eyes fixed not on the beings before him, but on the symphony within them, hearing the pulse of their midi-chlorians like notes in a song only he could conduct, certain that with enough patience, enough will, enough obsession, he could turn that song into a hymn of eternity, never realizing that his own arrogance would one day write the final verse. The long apprenticeship of Hego Damask, known in the Sith tradition as Darth Plagueis, reached its inevitable turning point in the final days of his master Darth Tenebrous. For the rule of two had always carried within it the seed of betrayal, master and apprentice bound together in a dance that could end only with death. And though Tenebrous had taught his pupil to think in probabilities and equations, to analyze futures as if they were sums to be solved, he had blinded himself with arrogance, believing he had mastered even betrayal, believing that his foresight allowed him to calculate every possible path and ensure his survival. Yet the Sith are never immune to irony, and in the end it was his own certainty that opened the door to his fall. The two traveled often together, cloaked as financier and consultant, yet always moving in secrecy to worlds forgotten or remote. And it was on one such journey, deep within caverns, where ore was mined for technologies they intended to exploit, that their bond began to unravel. For Plagueis, whose obsession with manipulation of midi-chlorians had grown into an all-consuming faith, began to see that his master's teachings, though brilliant, were a cage, a set of numbers that could never account for the vast truth he had brushed against in his experiments, and he resolved that he would no longer live in the shadow of Tenebrous' calculations. The confrontation was not one of fire and spectacle, but of inevitability, as most Sith duels are. Two shadows who had long studied one another turning at last into enemies, their blades igniting in the silence of the cavern, one curved and elegant, the other long and pale in Muun hands. The clash of red energy filling the tunnels with a hum that echoed like the heart of the dark side itself. Tenebrous fought with the grace of a master who believed himself untouchable, his strikes measured, his counters precise, each move the product of a mind that had already run through every possibility, yet Plagueis pressed forward with patience and control. His tall form relentless, his strikes not wild but deliberate, each one testing the limits of his master's foresight, each one a reminder that equations cannot account for Tenebrous' calculations. The confrontation was not one of fire and spectacle, but of inevitability, as most Sith duels are. Two shadows who had long studied one another turning at last into enemies, their blades igniting in the silence of the cavern, one curved and elegant, the other long and pale in Muun hands. The clash of red energy filling the tunnels with a hum that echoed like the heart of the dark side itself. Tenebrous fought with the grace of a master who believed himself untouchable, his strikes measured, his counters precise, each move the product of a mind that had already run through every possibility, yet Plagueis pressed forward with patience and control, or will, for obsession, for the hunger of an apprentice who has waited too long. And as the duel stretched on, Plagueis revealed the fruits of his studies, surges of power that disrupted the rhythm Tenebrous expected, sudden bursts, his tall form relentless, his strikes not wild but deliberate, each one testing the limits of his master's foresight, each one a reminder that equations cannot account for of manipulation that twisted the very air. Not raw fury, but controlled experiments unleashed as weapons, and Tenebrous faltered, his calculations collapsing beneath the weight of unpredictability, until at last Plagueis struck the decisive blow, cutting his master down amid the dust and silence of the will, for obsession, for the hunger of an apprentice who has waited too long. And as the duel stretched on, Plagueis revealed the fruits of his studies, surges of power that disrupted the rhythm Tenebrous expected, sudden bursts of manipulation that twisted the very air, not raw fury but controlled experiments unleashed as weapons, and Tenebrous faltered, his calculations collapsing beneath the weight of unpredictability, until at last Plagueis struck the decisive blow, cutting his master down amid the dust and silence of the with him both the wisdom of his master and the certainty that he had surpassed him, stepping fully into the role of Darth Plagueis the Wise, a title not yet whispered in fear, but already etched in the current of the Force. And as you picture this now, imagine the cavern after the duel, its stone walls silent, its air still heavy with the scent of ozone, the glow of sabers gone, only the dust settling slowly over the body of a fallen Sith, while far above, the galaxy turned unaware, its citizens going about their lives never knowing that in that quiet mine, a master had died, and a legend had begun, a legend of a Muun who sought eternity itself. A legend that would end, as all Sith legends do, in betrayal, but whose echo would never fade, carried forever in whispers through the stars. With the death of Darth Tenebrous and the mantle of Dark Lord now his alone, Darth Plagueis stepped into the galaxy not with the roar of fleets or the proclamation of banners, but with the careful donning of a mask, the identity he had cultivated for decades. Hego Damask, high-ranking financier of the intergalactic banking clan, a Muun of impeccable reputation, known across core and mid-rim alike as a shrewd investor, a quiet philanthropist, and a figure whose cold brilliance in economics made him indispensable to senators, corporations, and planetary leaders alike. It was in this guise that Plagueis moved more freely than any Sith before him. For while others hid in tombs or cloaked themselves in obscure orders, he walked openly among the galaxy's most powerful figures. His very presence welcomed, his advice sought, his influence disguised as financial necessity, and thus he held the reins of empires not through threats, but through credit lines, restructuring debts of failing governments, bailing out corporations in exchange for concessions, and weaving a web so subtle that none realized they were already entangled. To the Republic, Hego Damask was a Muun who embodied the ideals of stability and progress. A man who believed in order and prosperity, yet behind that elongated face and calm voice stirred the cold patience of a Sith Lord, whose every transaction was a move in a larger game, whose every meeting in Senate halls was as much a duel as any clash of sabers. He understood that the Republic, though vast and ancient, was weak, paralyzed by bureaucracy, strangled by corruption, and addicted to the credits his banking clan provided, and so he ensured that dependence deepened, crafting economic structures where the Republic's fleets, trade routes, and even its food supplies were tied to loans and agreements that he controlled, binding worlds not with chains, but with signatures, ensuring that when the time came, the Sith would not need to topple the Republic from the outside, for it would collapse from within. Yet while wealth was his mask, his true pursuit remained his experiments, and as Hego Damask, he acquired laboratories under the pretense of medical research, funded genetic studies under the guise of philanthropy, and filled quiet estates on remote worlds with instruments of both science and sorcery, where he continued to bend midi-chlorians to his will, pushing further into the mystery of life and death. The genius of this mask was that it concealed not only his identity, but his philosophy, for the galaxy saw in him nothing more than a banker and philanthropist. Never suspecting that he was a Sith Lord who dreamed of ending mortality itself, his dealings brought him into contact with senators who whispered to him of debts, with guild leaders who sought his favor, with trade federation officials eager for his backing. And in each of them, he planted seeds of corruption, not by force, but by offering exactly what they wanted: wealth, security, advantage, until entire sectors of the galaxy moved at his quiet urging, unaware that they were carrying out the will of the Sith. Yet for all his subtlety, there was also pride in the mask, for Plagueis believed that unlike the brutish Sith of old, who revealed themselves in fire and perished quickly, he had found the perfect balance a way to be both hidden and in plain sight, to rule without appearing to rule. And he looked upon his growing influence with the certainty that the galaxy was already his to shape, that the dream of an eternal Sith order was within his grasp. And yet, the irony of the mask was that it made him believe he was untouchable, that no apprentice would dare betray him so long as he controlled not only knowledge, but the lifeblood of galactic politics. For who would strike down the hand that fed them? Who would dare to sever themselves from the master who had the power to make worlds live or die with a single financial decree? But as you let this chapter drift across you now, picture Coruscant's shining towers, senators in their floating pods debating endlessly while Hego Damask sat in shadowed balconies, his long moon fingers steepled, his expression serene, offering solutions that seemed generous yet bound the Republic tighter to his grasp. Picture the banking clan citadels on Scipio, their cold marble halls filled with echoes of contracts and credits, while deep below in hidden laboratories, Plagueis whispered to the Force itself, bending it toward his dream of eternity, his mask flawless, his influence vast, his patience endless, and his legend, though unknown to the galaxy at large, already unfolding in silence. The legend of a Sith Lord who conquered not through armies, but through economics, who ruled not through fear, but through dependence, and who believed with chilling certainty that he had found the perfect disguise, never realizing that in the very perfection of the mask lay the seeds of the tragedy that would one day end him. The mask of Hego Damask did not simply allow Darth Plagueis to walk unseen. It became the very foundation upon which he built the next stage of the Sith's rise. For in this guise he wove himself into the arteries of the Republic's lifeblood, the flow of credits and debts that sustained its fleets, its trade, and its endless bureaucracy. And with every passing year, his hand pressed more firmly upon the levers of power, though never in ways that drew suspicion, for his genius was subtlety, the art of making senators believe that they themselves were steering the ship, while he quietly adjusted the currents. Through Damask Holdings, he invested in starship foundries, mining consortia, and agrarian supply chains, ensuring that no great project in the galaxy, whether a fleet refit or a planetary relief effort, could succeed without funds that traced back to him. When crises struck, as they often did on the rimward worlds where piracy and instability were constant, Damask was there to provide loans on favorable terms, restructuring planetary economies in exchange for small concessions of sovereignty, and one by one, systems that had once stood proudly as independent members of the Republic found themselves bound by invisible chains, their futures mortgaged to the banking clan, whose voice Plagueis commanded. In the Senate he never shouted, never threatened, but his presence loomed in the background, for senators who owed him favors or worlds, that owed him credits voted as he wished, not out of loyalty, but necessity. And in this way, he built a coalition without ever declaring one, shaping Republic policy as deftly as a Sith manipulates a lightsaber's blade. Yet behind the calm mask, his true work continued, for every financial empire he built also served as a front for experiments, laboratories hidden on corporate worlds where no Jedi would ever suspect, research disguised as medical or agricultural innovation, but in truth serving his obsession with manipulating midi-chlorians, each discovery paid for by public credits, each breakthrough hidden behind the language of profit and philanthropy. His estates on remote worlds became sanctuaries of dark study, where he gathered not only scientists loyal to the banking clan, but also alchemists, droid engineers, and geneticists, their work converging into a singular purpose, the bending of life itself to his design. And what made the mask so effective was that no one imagined such a moon, thin and distant, could be anything other than a calculating banker, for the galaxy had grown accustomed to seeing moons as creatures of ledgers and contracts, not of sorcery and death. And so they underestimated him, never suspecting that in the same chambers where they signed treaties, he envisioned the end of death, never suspecting that the same hand which signed loans also reached into the living force and commanded it to reshape itself. Still, Plagueis was patient, and he moved slowly, avoiding rash moves, for he knew the Jedi could not be provoked too soon, and so he played the long game, nudging the Republic toward decadence, ensuring its addiction to banking and credit deepened, watching as senators argued themselves into paralysis while his influence grew. And he took satisfaction not in wealth for its own sake, but in the control it afforded, for credits were simply another form of power. A means to reshape the galaxy without firing a shot, a tool as sharp and dangerous as any saber. Through this mask, he also began to cultivate relationships with younger politicians, governors, and ambitious senators who saw in Damask a patron, someone who could back their rise. And though few realized it, he was already searching, quietly, for the apprentice who would one day join him in breaking the rule of two, an apprentice who would share in his vision of eternity, not as rival but as partner. Yet for now the mask was all, and Plagueis wore it flawlessly, moving through banquets and banking councils, his tall frame always slightly apart from the crowd, his voice calm, his promises measured, while beneath the surface of every word and every smile, the dark side coiled, whispering through him as he prepared the galaxy for the storm to come. And as you picture this now, imagine the Senate Rotunda on Coruscant, pods drifting outward with endless speeches, while in a private box a Muun sits silently, his long fingers steepled, his gaze unreadable. Every senator who speaks believing they act freely, not realizing they are already dancing on threads he has woven, and somewhere beyond the city's glow, in a laboratory hidden among cold mountains, the same Muun bends over an experiment where life itself is stretched, twisted, and studied, his dual identities flowing seamlessly together, the banker and the Sith, the mask and the shadow, both working in perfect harmony to shape the future. And in this harmony lay the illusion of control that would one day betray him, but for now seemed as solid and eternal as the credits that kept the galaxy alive. In the long game that Darth Plagueis played beneath the mask of Hego Damask, there came at last a moment that would define his legacy more than all his experiments, more than his credits and contracts. For in his search for an apprentice who could share in his vision of eternity, he turned his eyes toward a quiet jewel of the Mid-Rim, the lush world of Naboo, a planet outwardly serene, famous for its lakes and palaces, its pastoral beauty masking the same political ambition and corruption that plagued every corner of the Republic. And it was here that Plagueis first encountered the youth who would one day eclipse him, Palpatine, son of a wealthy Naboo family, brilliant, restless, and filled with a darkness that even as a child had separated him from his peers. The boy's family name carried weight in the politics of Naboo, and yet within his household Palpatine felt imprisoned, his father stern and dismissive, his mother indulgent but powerless, and from these tensions grew a simmering hatred, a quiet certainty that he was destined for something far greater than the provincial politics of Theed. And it was this ambition, this burning dissatisfaction, that Plagueis sensed from the first moment they met. The encounter was no accident, for Plagueis, in his guise as Hego Damask, often traveled Naboo's political circles, presenting himself as a patron of trade negotiations and an ally of the planet's influential families. And it was during one of these visits that he noted the presence of a young man whose gaze was sharper than his years, whose words, though polite, carried hidden venom, and whose very aura in the Force shimmered with potential untapped. Plagueis watched him closely and soon arranged private meetings, first under the pretext of business, then under the subtler guise of mentorship, speaking to him about politics, about power, about the failures of the Republic, each word a thread laid carefully until Palpatine's trust was won, though in truth it was not trust but recognition. For Palpatine saw in Damask not a banker, but a doorway, an opportunity to step beyond the confines of Naboo, to reach the heights he already believed were his destiny. Slowly, Plagueis peeled back the layers of disguise, revealing hints of the dark knowledge he carried, speaking of the Sith not as myths, but as living truth, and in the boy's widening hunger, he saw confirmation that this was the apprentice he had long awaited. Palpatine's resentment of his father deepened with every lesson. His disdain for the weakness of politicians sharpened with every story, and soon the young man embraced the teachings of Plagueis as though they were the fulfillment of his own secret thoughts. As though the Sith Lord had simply given voice to what he had always known, that compassion was weakness, that manipulation was strength, that destiny belonged to those bold enough to seize it. In time, Plagueis whispered the ancient truth, naming him Darth Sidious, apprentice in the rule of two, and in that naming bound him into the cycle of master and student that had endured since Bane's time. Yet even as he trained the boy, teaching him to mask his power behind a politician's smile, to wield persuasion as deftly as a blade, to cloak his ambition beneath the robes of a senator, Plagueis believed he was shaping not a rival, but a partner, someone who could stand beside him when death itself was finally defeated, someone who could help him forge a Sith dynasty that would outlast every empire before it. And in this belief lay his greatest blindness, for Palpatine, though eager and obedient, absorbed his master's lessons not with loyalty, but with cunning, even as a youth dreaming of the day he would eclipse the moon, the day when he alone would hold the galaxy in his hand, and in the soft glow of Naboo's lakeside palaces, in the echo of their secret meetings, the seeds of betrayal were already being planted. But for now the master and apprentice walked together, their bond sealed, Plagueis convinced that he had at last found the vessel worthy of his wisdom, and Palpatine convinced that he had at last found the key to his ascent. Two shadows bound by the same current yet destined to collide, and as you let this part of the story drift into your mind, picture the world of Naboo's serene waters reflecting starry skies, grand halls filled with senators and noblemen, and somewhere in a quiet chamber, a tall moon and a young nobleman speak in hushed tones, their words shaping the fate of the galaxy, their partnership the spark that would ignite the fall of the Republic and the rise of an empire, a partnership remembered forever in whispers of tragedy and betrayal. The relationship between Hego Damask and the young Palpatine deepened in the months and years that followed their first meeting. For though their early conversations were cloaked in the language of politics and commerce, beneath every word lay a darker undercurrent, a current Plagueis carefully fed, recognizing in the boy's questions and silences the restless hunger of one who despised weakness and yearned to transcend it. At first, Damask spoke of the galaxy in practical terms, of how the Republic's Senate was a lumbering beast crippled by procedure, of how the Jedi pretended to guardianship but had become tools of corruption, and of how the true levers of power were never in speeches or laws, but in the invisible threads of money, influence, and fear. And Palpatine, still young enough to seem innocent to his family and peers, absorbed these lessons with quiet fascination, his sharp eyes betraying a mind already more cunning than most senators 3 times his age. In secret walks along the lakes of Naboo, or in shadowed offices beneath the domes of Theed, Damask fed him visions of a galaxy remade, not ruled by compromise, but by will, not governed by fragile ideals, but by strength. And though Plagueis cloaked these lessons as observations, the boy began to hear them as commandments, as truth he had always felt but never dared to name. He had long despised his father, who he believed represented everything petty and provincial in Naboo society. A man of status but no vision, of authority but no strength. And under Damask's subtle encouragement, that contempt hardened into hatred until young Palpatine no longer saw himself as the son of a noble family, but as someone apart, destined to escape their shadow and rise far beyond their narrow world. In time, the mask of Damask slipped further, though never fully, as Plagueis began to test the boy with glimpses of the Force, demonstrating how anger could sharpen perception, how focus could turn thought into action, how emotions, when embraced rather than denied, could be the fuel of power. And in these demonstrations, Palpatine felt the confirmation of his own dark stirrings, the validation that the discontent within him was not weakness, but potential. Slowly, Plagueis taught him the history of the Sith, not in the mythic tones the Jedi used when warning of the dark side, but as a lineage of pragmatists, visionaries, and conquerors who had sought to break free from the chains of hypocrisy. And Palpatine, with his keen political instincts, listened as though every tale were a prophecy of his own future. The two became inseparable in secret, their relationship cloaked even from those closest to Palpatine, his family assuming he was simply mentored by a wealthy patron, never realizing that beneath those conversations of trade and politics, their son was being reshaped into something unrecognizable. And the boy himself, though he still wore the face of a dutiful student and loyal citizen, began to practice deception with growing skill, learning from Damask that the mask was as important as the blade, that a Sith did not conquer by announcing himself, but by hiding until the moment was perfect. In time, Palpatine's resentment of his father reached its breaking point, and under Plagueis' subtle but undeniable influence, he turned that hatred into action, severing the last tie to his family with a decision that revealed his full willingness to embrace the Sith path, an act that bound him forever to the dark side. In the quiet aftermath, Plagueis named him Apprentice and gave him a new name, Darth Sidious, the title that marked him not as a boy of Naboo, but as the heir to the Sith legacy. And in that naming, the rule of 2 was renewed. The line of masters and apprentices stretching back to Darth Bane continued, and the galaxy, still oblivious, moved closer to its darkest chapter. Yet in these early years, before empires and betrayals, there was a strange harmony between them. For Plagueis believed he had found in Sidious the perfect vessel for his vision of eternity, an apprentice not reckless but brilliant, not rebellious but calculating, and Sidious, still young and eager, cloaked his own ambition enough to play the role of student with flawless obedience, listening to every word, studying every gesture, and secretly planning the day when he would need no master at all. And as you let this chapter drift into your thoughts now, imagine the serene landscapes of Naboo, the silver lakes reflecting moonlight, the quiet gardens and grand palaces filled with laughter and music. And then picture, hidden within that beauty, a tall Muun and a sharp-eyed youth sitting in hushed conversation, the older speaking with calm certainty, the younger listening with quiet hunger. And in that private moment, the fate of the Republic is being decided, the seeds of the Empire already planted in whispers, carried only by the night air, unnoticed by the galaxy, but destined to reshape it forever. Once the name Darth Sidious was bestowed, the relationship between master and apprentice shifted into its inevitable rhythm. For though Plagueis still wore the mask of Hego Damask in public, guiding economies and senators with the same precision as ever, behind closed doors he became the relentless teacher, shaping Palpatine's raw ambition into the finely honed blade of a Sith Lord. Training did not begin with sabers or lightning, but with philosophy. For Plagueis understood that the true strength of the Sith was not in spectacle, but in vision. And so he filled the mind of his apprentice with the lineage of the dark side, recounting tales of Bane and Zana, of Revan and Malak, of the ancient lords of Korriban, not as distant legends, but as steps in a chain of knowledge, each one a failed attempt at the true destiny of the Sith, each one a warning that only by uniting cunning, patience, and control could the dream be fulfilled. Sidious absorbed these lessons eagerly and in time surpassed them, for his political instincts allowed him to interpret Sith history not merely as battles of passion, but as strategies of power. And Plagueis saw in him the potential not only for mastery of the Force, but for mastery of the Republic itself. Their nights were long sessions of meditation, where Plagueis would teach him to listen to the whisper of the midi-chlorians, to sense the currents of life and bend them subtly, to draw strength from anger but never be consumed by it, to cloak himself so completely in serenity that even the most perceptive Jedi might stand before him and see nothing more than a shrewd young politician. When they sparred, Plagueis demanded precision, teaching that victory came not from rage but from inevitability, that every strike must serve a purpose, that every feint was part of a calculation. And though Sidious often burned with a desire to unleash his full fury, he learned to restrain himself, to wield his emotions as tools rather than chains. And in this he became more dangerous than any Sith before him. Their experiments grew darker as well, for Plagueis brought his apprentice into his laboratories, showing him the secrets of midi-chlorian manipulation, the way life could be lengthened, twisted, or extinguished. And Sidious, fascinated, joined eagerly in the experiments, not because he shared his master's dream of immortality, but because he understood the value of such knowledge. For to him every discovery was another instrument of control, another way to bind allies or torment enemies. And though he nodded when Plagueis spoke of breaking the cycle of death, inwardly he dismissed the obsession as weakness, a blind spot he would one day exploit. Yet outwardly he was the perfect apprentice, eager, obedient, cunning, always flattering his master with careful words, always asking questions that seemed deferential, and Plagueis, convinced he had finally found a partner worthy of eternity, trusted him more than he should, allowing Sidious access to his knowledge, to his secrets, to the very heart of Sith lore. Together, they shaped plans for the Republic, Plagueis focusing on the financial and systemic corruption that would collapse it. Sidious already envisioning himself at its helm, and the harmony between them in those years was enough to make even the Force tremble. For master and apprentice together were a storm disguised as silence, a shadow moving across the galaxy unnoticed, preparing for the moment when the Jedi would be caught unawares. And yet, as always with the Sith, beneath the harmony was hunger, the apprentice watching his master, waiting, knowing that one day the rule of two would demand its price, but biding his time until the moment would be perfect. Still, in those long years of training, Sidious became what Plagueis had hoped, a master manipulator, a politician who could charm while deceiving, a warrior who could strike with lethal precision, a Sith Lord who could hide in plain sight, his crimson blade still secret, his true power veiled beneath the smile of a Naboo senator. And as you picture this part of the tale now, imagine the chambers where they trained, laboratories filled with cold light, meditation rooms echoing with ancient chants, sparring halls where blades of red hissed through the air, and always the tall Muun and the sharp-eyed human, master and apprentice, bound by ambition, shaping not only themselves, but the destiny of the galaxy, a destiny that neither Jedi nor Republic suspected, a destiny that would one day be sealed by betrayal, but which in this era of training felt to Plagueis like the fulfillment of his dream, the dream of a dynasty of Sith that would never fall, a dream he believed was finally within reach. The training of Darth Sidious under Darth Plagueis was not a single path, but a weaving of many strands, for his master believed that to forge a Sith worthy of destiny, one had to train him not only in the arts of combat or the rituals of the dark side, but in the subtler crafts of survival, deception, and governance. And so Palpatine's lessons stretched across every domain of life, each day carrying him deeper into the labyrinth of Sith wisdom. There were nights spent in meditation chambers where Plagueis demanded stillness so profound that Sidious could feel the shifting of every midi-chlorian in his body, learning to command them with will alone until his very breath became an instrument of power. There were days spent in the Senate galleries on Coruscant, where Plagueis instructed him to watch the endless debates, to listen not to the words, but to the silences, to observe which senators stalled, which bartered favors, which masked their greed behind noble speeches. And in these lessons, Sidious grew into a master politician before he had even held a seat, already learning how to manipulate egos and fears with the same precision as one manipulates a blade. There were secret journeys to Sith worlds, where Plagueis revealed to him the tombs of ancient lords, teaching him to sense the echoes of power that lingered in stone and sand, warning him of arrogance but also showing him that the dark side left imprints deeper than death, and Sidious knelt in those tombs with quiet reverence, though in his heart he already believed he would one day surpass every name carved into those walls. In laboratories, Plagueis unveiled his most forbidden experiments, guiding Sidious through the manipulation of life itself, showing him how midi-chlorians could be coaxed into rapid division or slowed into hibernation, how the energy of the Force could be focused into healing or perverted into destruction. And though Sidious marveled at the demonstrations, he regarded them less as a path to immortality and more as tools for control, recognizing that the promise of eternal life could be the greatest temptation with which to bind allies and apprentices in the future. In combat training, Plagueis emphasized precision and patience, teaching him that rage burned quickly while calculation endured, drilling him until every strike of his crimson blade was not merely an attack, but a step in a larger pattern, until Sidious could anticipate his master's moves not through guesswork, but through the cold logic of inevitability. And yet, the greatest lessons were not in chambers or fields of study, but in conversation. In the long dialogues where master and apprentice debated philosophy, the nature of power, the destiny of the Sith, with Plagueis arguing that their purpose was to end the cycle, to build a dynasty that would never die, and Sidious listening with practiced obedience, nodding in apparent agreement even as in the shadows of his mind he dismissed the vision as flawed, believing that power could never be shared, that the very idea of a dynasty of equals was weakness, but keeping this hidden until the day when it would serve him. To Plagueis, Sidious was the perfect apprentice, one who absorbed knowledge without hesitation, who masked his ambition with charm, who could sit in a Senate banquet smiling while secretly plotting the downfall of everyone in the room, and he trusted him enough to reveal his most precious secrets, never realizing that in doing so, he was digging his own grave. For Sidious, though shaped by his master, was not bound by him. And while he practiced every lesson from the stillness of meditation to the subtleties of manipulation, he also practiced deception, learning to conceal the depth of his own hunger, learning to let Plagueis believe that they were bound in shared purpose, while preparing in silence for the moment when he would be strong enough to claim everything for himself. And so the training years passed. The master perfecting his experiments, the apprentice perfecting his mask, the two together forming a shadow so vast that it stretched across the Republic unnoticed, preparing the galaxy for collapse, preparing the Jedi for a fall they would not see until it was too late. And as you let this part of the story rest in your thoughts, imagine the duality of these lessons: the Muun Sith Lord, tall and austere, explaining with calm patience the mathematics of the Force, and the young human, sharp-eyed and ambitious, bowing his head as if in obedience while secretly dreaming of the day when he would sit alone upon a throne, the harmony of their bond only an illusion. The training not only a preparation for the Sith's rise, but for the Master's inevitable downfall, written already in the silence between their words. The training of Darth Sidious under Darth Plagueis did not remain confined to chambers of meditation or laboratories of forbidden science, for their ambitions were far larger than the secrets of the Force alone, and together master and apprentice turned their gaze to the Republic itself, a government vast and ancient, burdened by corruption, choked by bureaucracy, and already ripe for manipulation. And it was here that the true genius of their partnership emerged, for Plagueis' wealth and influence through the intergalactic banking clan provided the means, while Sidious' charm and political instincts provided the mask. They began quietly, weaving networks of alliances among corporations, guilds, and trade federations, using loans and promises to bind them into dependence, whispering of a republic that no longer served its people, of Jedi who meddled too much, of senators too distracted by endless debates to protect commerce. And in this fertile soil of discontent they planted the seeds of future conflict. Plagueis, ever the patient financier, ensured that major sectors of the economy bent subtly to their will, while Sidious, still publicly only an ambitious young politician from Naboo, learned to play the Senate like an instrument, observing who could be bribed, who could be threatened, and who could be maneuvered into paralysis with nothing more than procedure. Together they stoked instability, not in dramatic coups, but in quiet increments, pushing legislation that favored trade guilds, encouraging disputes in the Outer Rim, and quietly sabotaging peacekeeping measures so that pirates and mercenaries thrived, all the while presenting these crises as natural, the product of an overextended republic, never revealing the invisible hands guiding them. In the boardrooms of the Trade Federation, they encouraged leaders like Newt Gunray to seek greater autonomy, fanning fears that the Republic's taxation and oversight would ruin them, while in the councils of the banking clan, Plagueis shifted credit lines so that entire sectors could be controlled with the flick of his hand. Sidious, for his part, cultivated relationships among young senators and governors, presenting himself as a sympathetic listener, a rising star who could balance Naboo's innocence with core world pragmatism, hiding his darkness behind a mask of courtesy that charmed all who met him. And in this way, the two Sith began to engineer the slow erosion of the Republic's foundations, weakening it not with battles, but with complacency, not with open war, but with the rot of corruption. Yet, even as they worked, their visions diverged subtly, for Plagueis still dreamed of a Sith dynasty built on control and immortality, while Sidious dreamed of absolute dominion for himself. But in these years, the divergence mattered little, for together their combined strategy was flawless, and the Jedi remained oblivious, too blinded by their own traditions to see the dark tide rising beneath their feet. When crises flared, such as disputes over trade routes or taxation of Outer Rim systems, it was always their hands pulling strings in the shadows, always their credits funding the conflicts, and the Senate, drowning in procedure, only grew weaker, its members too busy lining their pockets or protecting their interests to recognize that the Republic itself was being reshaped. Sidious in particular learned to savor these games, practicing his double life with growing mastery, giving passionate speeches by day, then kneeling before his master at night to discuss how each new act of legislation, each new economic crisis, each new vote of no confidence moved the galaxy one step closer to collapse. And Plagueis, watching, believed with satisfaction that his apprentice was proving himself worthy, never realizing that each lesson absorbed was also one more step toward betrayal. And as the years passed, the galaxy slid steadily toward the crisis that would one day be known as the Phantom Menace. The seeds planted by these two Sith Lords sprouting into vines that wrapped themselves around every institution of the Republic, choking it slowly, invisibly, until the stage was set for the final unraveling. And as you imagine this now, picture the Senate Rotunda, its pods drifting outward with endless debate, while somewhere in the shadows of a balcony, Sidious listens with a polite smile, knowing the outcome has already been decided by credits Plagueis shifted weeks before. Picture the boardrooms of the Trade Federation filled with anxious voices, never suspecting that their fears are being stoked deliberately by the calm words of a moon financier. Picture the Jedi Temple, serene and confident, its masters meditating in ignorance, while the very Republic they serve slips into the grasp of the Sith. And know that in this quiet era of plotting, the true war began, not with sabers drawn, but with whispers, contracts, and carefully planted doubts, the first movements of a storm that would one day sweep away the Republic forever. The seeds that Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious planted did not remain small whispers for long, for with every year that passed, their roots sank deeper into the soil of the Republic, twisting through its institutions until even the most routine proceedings carried the faint scent of corruption. Plagueis, under the guise of Hego Damask, continued to reshape the financial arteries of the galaxy, making planetary governments more dependent on loans from the banking clan, encouraging corporations like the Trade Federation, the Techno Union, and the Commerce Guild to expand their private militaries under the pretense of defending their shipping lanes, all while ensuring that the Republic Senate looked the other way in exchange for steady streams of credits. Sidious, still only a Naboo politician in the public eye, shadowed his master's maneuvers by weaving a network of personal influence in the Senate itself. Courting allies through charm, feigned humility, and promises of partnership, while keeping careful track of every weakness he could exploit in the years to come, each senator's greed, fear, or ambition catalogued like weapons waiting to be drawn. Together, they nurtured discontent in the Outer Rim, where worlds long ignored by the core began to see the Republic not as protector, but as parasite, draining resources through taxation without providing stability in return. And when those worlds raised complaints, the Senate stalled in endless debate, just as Plagueis and Sidious had designed. For every stalemate deepened resentment, and every delay widened the cracks in the Republic's unity. In secret meetings with leaders of the Trade Federation, the Sith whispered that the Senate could not be trusted, that the Jedi were no longer guardians, but meddlers, and that only independence, backed by strong fleets, could preserve their interests. And so Newt Gunray and others were encouraged to expand their droid armies, never realizing that they were being guided step by step toward the role of pawns in a far greater game. At the same time, Plagueis worked to destabilize the Republic's economy, allowing recessions and credit crises to simmer just long enough to create desperation, then offering solutions that gave the banking clan more control, ensuring that when the moment came, whole star systems would already be chained to Sith-controlled debt. The brilliance of their scheme lay in how invisible it seemed, for every act of sabotage looked like natural consequence. Every manipulated crisis looked like the result of ordinary corruption, and the Jedi, blind to the Sith's return, saw only politics, not shadow. Their focus turned inward on philosophy, while the galaxy's very foundation was rotting beneath them. Sidious sharpened his skills in duplicity by playing both roles, the loyal Naboo senator rising in esteem, and the secret Sith apprentice kneeling before Plagueis, and though he bowed in obedience, his mind was already crafting a vision of his own reign. A reign where he alone would rule, and where even his master's obsession with immortality would have no place. But for now, he played the student perfectly, carrying out instructions, manipulating allies, sabotaging enemies, and reporting back with deferential words that concealed his hunger. Together, master and apprentice cultivated a galaxy that seemed stable, but was in truth a tinderbox, its senators fat with complacency, its corporations armed with secret droid armies, its rim worlds disillusioned, its Jedi out of touch, and at the center of it all, invisible and patient, the Sith, weaving a tapestry of corruption and discontent so intricate that when the moment finally came, when a spark was struck on Naboo and a crisis engulfed the Senate, the galaxy would already be primed to collapse, ready to accept the strong hand of a new order. And as you imagine this, picture the Republic at twilight, its towers on Coruscant glowing gold in the fading sun, senators laughing in banquet halls while deals are struck in back rooms, freighters moving through hyperspace with droid armies hidden in their holds, and somewhere in the shadows a tall moon and a sharp-eyed human sit in quiet conversation, their words measured, their plans unfolding, knowing that the greatest war the galaxy had ever seen would not begin with blaster fire, but with laws and credits, with greed and fear, with a soft planting of seeds that would grow into the storm of the Phantom Menace. For all his brilliance in politics and finance, for all his subtlety in guiding senators and corporations, the heart of Darth Plagueis was not in credits or contracts, but in his laboratories, in the long and silent hours where he bent over instruments and meditated upon the currents of the Force, seeking the one truth that had eluded every Sith Lord before him, the conquest of death itself, the mastery of life so complete that no betrayal, no illness, no blade could ever end his dominion. The obsession that had first taken root in the days of his apprenticeship flowered fully now, and he pursued it with the calm intensity of a man who believed his destiny was absolute, gathering scientists, healers, and scholars under the guise of Hego Damask's philanthropic ventures, funding research into regeneration and genetics, and using their discoveries as stepping stones to ever darker experiments, never revealing to them the true nature of his work, for only he could see the pattern he believed was emerging. To Plagueis, the midi-chlorians were the key, not mystical abstractions, but living symbionts that carried the Force into every being, and through meditation and will he learned to influence them, to nudge them into rapid replication, to slow their decline, to command them to heal wounds that should have been mortal, to extend vitality far beyond its natural span. And with each success, his confidence grew until he believed he had come to the very edge of immortality itself. There were nights when he would draw the life from one being and pour it into another, watching vitality transfer as if it were water in a vessel, and he told himself that soon he would discover how to hold life forever, to make himself unassailable, to end the very cycle that had doomed the Sith for 1,000 years. Yet the deeper he went into this pursuit, the more he withdrew from the world beyond, leaving his apprentice Sidious to take on more of the political maneuvering. For while Sidious sharpened his mask in the Senate, Plagueis secluded himself in laboratories on hidden worlds, surrounded by the hum of machines and the faint cries of test subjects, listening to the whispers of the Force as though it might one day answer his questions directly. And still, despite all his wisdom, he failed to see the danger in his obsession, for he convinced himself that his apprentice was loyal, that Sidious shared his vision of a Sith dynasty, freed from the rule of two, that together they would reign without fear of betrayal, because betrayal itself would be meaningless when death no longer existed. But in truth, Sidious listened only to the lessons that served him and dismissed the rest as weakness, seeing in his master's fixation on immortality not strength, but vulnerability, a blind spot to be exploited. Still, Plagueis pressed on, whispering to the Force as though coaxing a great beast to bend, believing that he had even brushed against the possibility of creating life itself, a claim that would later echo in the whispers of his legend, though whether he truly succeeded or not will forever remain uncertain. And in this final stretch of his studies, he felt himself closer than ever, able to prolong his own vitality, able to stretch his awareness beyond the limits of ordinary beings. So certain of his triumph that he failed to sense the cold ambition simmering in his apprentice, failed to remember that no Sith ever truly shares power, failed to see that while he sought eternity in the laboratory, eternity was slipping away in the real world, where Sidious prepared to seize what he had learned and discard the master who had given it to him. And as you let this chapter settle over you now, imagine the silent chambers of Plagueis Experiment's tanks filled with flickering lights, the faint hum of machinery blending with the whisper of the dark side, the tall Muun pacing slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes half closed in meditation, believing he had conquered death, never realizing that the simplest truth of all was about to undo him, that no calculation, no experiment, no command over life itself could protect him from the ambition of an apprentice who had already chosen the moment of betrayal. The deeper Darth Plagueis descended into his quest for immortality, the less the affairs of the galaxy seemed to matter to him. For the squabbles of senators and the maneuvers of corporations paled before what he believed was the ultimate task of existence, and so he spent entire seasons secluded in his sanctuaries, surrounded by data readouts, specimen tanks, and the low hum of machines. For his long Muun frame moved with the tireless patience of one convinced he was no longer bound to the same limits as other beings. He had come to view the midi-chlorians not as symbionts, but as instruments, strings in a vast symphony that only he could hear. And through long hours of meditation and experimentation, he refined his ability to influence them, coaxing them to resist disease, to regenerate cells, to slow the decay of age, and even to reverse wounds that should have ended life. At first, these powers were subtle, extending the lives of his test subjects by days or weeks. But as his skill grew, so too did the results, until he could stretch their vitality into years beyond what nature had allotted. And with every success, his conviction hardened that he was on the verge of perfection. Yet obsession is rarely satisfied, and Plagueis began to hunger not only to preserve life, but to generate it, to spark existence where none had been, whispering to the Force itself as if commanding it to quicken new souls, to fill the void with breath and blood at his will. In the legends that survived, some whispered that it was Plagueis who first conceived the possibility that a being like Anakin Skywalker might have been born through the manipulation of midi-chlorians, though whether this was truth or myth is unknown. For in his secret chambers, Plagueis guarded his discoveries fiercely, unwilling even to share their fullest extent with Sidious. Still, he believed he was making progress, and in his arrogance he told himself that the cycle of Sith betrayal would end with him. For if he and his apprentice could transcend mortality, then the rule of two would no longer demand succession by murder, and master and apprentice could reign eternally together. Yet in this conviction lay his blindness, for he mistook Sidious' obedience for loyalty, never realizing that the younger man listened only as long as it suited him, never realizing that to Sidious immortality was not destiny, but distraction. Even as Plagueis bent the Force to stretch the span of life, Sidious bent senators, guilds, and allies into his own orbit, practicing manipulation on a scale his master did not watch closely. For Plagueis, consumed by experiments, left the stage to him, believing that the apprentice's victories in politics were victories for them both. But while Sidious played the part of dutiful student, kneeling when required, nodding at his master's lessons, he inwardly saw in Plagueis' obsession the weakness that would make betrayal not only possible, but inevitable. And so he encouraged it, flattering his master's discoveries, feeding his sense of triumph, ensuring that the Muun delved ever deeper into laboratories and meditations, blind to the shifting balance of power. And as the years stretched on, Plagueis' obsession reached near mania, his journals filled with endless formulas and observations, his holocrons brimming with whispered conclusions, his voice growing more fevered as he convinced himself he had finally found the key, that immortality was not a dream but a truth waiting to be unlocked. Yet the irony of his pursuit was that even as he came closer to conquering death, he neglected the one danger that life itself could never escape the ambition of another, the hunger of the apprentice, the ancient rhythm that had defined the Sith since Bane, and which not even Plagueis' brilliance could silence. And so, though he believed himself untouchable, he was already surrounded by the quiet inevitability of his end, the laboratory that echoed with triumph already a tomb in waiting, the apprentice who bowed already sharpening his moment of betrayal, the dream of eternity already slipping beyond his grasp. And as you rest with this part of the story now, imagine Plagueis in those final years of obsession, his tall moon figure hunched over glowing tanks, his eyes fixed on streams of data, his lips murmuring to unseen currents of the Force, so certain that he was the first to command life and death themselves, never hearing the quiet steps of fate drawing closer, never realizing that even if he could conquer death itself, he could never conquer the nature of the Sith, and that immortality, for him, would exist only as a whisper in legend, a story told long after his breath was gone. The end of Darth Plagueis. The Wise did not come on a battlefield or in a grand duel beneath storm-filled skies, but in the quietest of settings, in a moment so ordinary it seemed almost cruel. For the Muun, who had spent a lifetime seeking to conquer death, who had bent midi-chlorians to his will and stretched the span of life beyond nature's limits, who had whispered to the Force itself as though commanding eternity, met his fate in the solitude of his own chambers. Betrayed not by weakness of body, but by the ambition of the one he had trusted most. It was after a night of political triumph when Plagueis and his apprentice, known now to the galaxy as Senator Palpatine of Naboo but in secret as Darth Sidious, had celebrated the consolidation of new alliances, their web of influence tighter than ever, their plans nearer to fruition, and Plagueis, certain that destiny was his, allowed himself the indulgence of wine and conversation, speaking freely of the victories they had achieved, of the galaxy's blindness to their ascent, of the nearness of his final breakthrough in immortality, and at last, weary from the night, he retired to rest. He believed himself safe, for what apprentice would dare strike when the promise of eternal life was so close? What fool would sever himself from the master who had unlocked such secrets? And so Plagueis, for all his caution, for all his cold wisdom, did what he had always sworn never to do. He let his guard fall. Sidious, watching with eyes that betrayed nothing but polite deference, waited until the breathing of his master slowed, until the long moon form lay still upon the bed. And then, with a precision as cold as it was merciless, he struck, not with blade but with the Force itself, pouring lightning into the body that had taught him, suffocating breath and crushing life, pressing attack after attack, while Plagueis struggled in the haze of sleep, too slow to rise, too stunned to fight, his mastery of midi-chlorians faltering beneath the storm of betrayal. There are whispers that he tried in those last moments to command life itself to resist, to order the Force to heal him, to forbid death from taking him, but the irony of his obsession was revealed for all his experiments, for all his triumphs. Death still came when he was unprepared, and the one who had sought to make himself eternal was undone in a single night by the ambition of the very apprentice he had believed would stand beside him forever. Sidious watched as his master's strength ebbed, calm and merciless, savoring the power that surged through him. For in that act, he was no longer apprentice but master, no longer student but Dark Lord of the Sith in his own right. And as Plagueis' breathing faded, as the life he had tried so hard to preserve slipped quietly away, the galaxy turned unseen, unaware that in that moment the fate of the Republic was sealed, for the Sith had risen again, hidden in the robes of a senator, cloaked behind the smile of a politician, carrying within him all the knowledge of his master, but none of his obsession with eternity, intent not on preserving life but on ruling it, on bending the galaxy to his will. The irony was cruel and perfect that a Muun who had spent his entire existence studying the defeat of death would be remembered only in a single whispered tale, a story told later by Sidious himself to a young Jedi named Anakin Skywalker, framed as a tragedy but in truth a boast. For in the end, Plagueis did not escape the cycle of the Sith. He became part of it, another master cut down by the apprentice he had raised, another name etched into the endless chain of ambition and betrayal. And as you let this part of the story rest over you now, imagine the chamber where it happened, the lights dim, the city of Coruscant sprawling endlessly beyond the windows, the tall figure of Plagueis lying in stillness, the sharp-eyed face of Sidious illuminated by faint glow as he delivers the final surge of energy, silence filling the room when it is done, silence that marks the death of a master and the birth of an empire, a silence that echoes through history, whispered in myth as the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. Though Darth Plagueis the Wise perished quietly in his own chamber, betrayed in sleep by the apprentice he had raised, his legacy did not die with him, for in every act of Darth Sidious, the imprint of his master could be felt, woven through the schemes that toppled the Republic and birthed the Empire, echoes of teachings that endured long after the man himself had faded. Sidious had no interest in preserving life as Plagueis had, nor in bending midi-chlorians toward immortality, for to him such pursuits were vanity, distractions from the true prize of unlimited power. Yet it was Plagueis who had given him the tools, the discipline, and the philosophy that allowed him to rise with such precision, who had taught him patience, the art of the mask, the necessity of striking from shadows rather than in fury, and Sidious carried these lessons forward with ruthless perfection. When he manipulated the Trade Federation into blockading Naboo, he was drawing upon the seeds first planted in boardrooms by Plagueis, who had taught him how greed and fear could be turned into weapons sharper than blades. When he rose in the Senate as Chancellor Palpatine, he was practicing the lessons of deception his master had drilled into him, the ability to wear a smile that concealed a dagger, to speak of peace while arranging war. When he orchestrated the Clone Wars, playing both sides to bleed the galaxy into exhaustion, he was executing on a scale his master had always envisioned, using economics and politics rather than brute force to create a crisis only he could resolve. And though Sidious cast aside Plagueis' obsession with eternal life, he inherited his faith in patience, his understanding that power was not seized in haste but cultivated over years. And it was this legacy that allowed him to move undetected, to rise from senator to emperor while the Jedi remained blind, never suspecting that the shadow of a Muun Sith Lord still stretched over them even after his death. Yet Sidious also learned from his master's flaws, for he recognized that Plagueis' obsession had made him vulnerable, too focused on experiments to watch the hunger of his apprentice, and so Sidious resolved never to be blinded, never to share true power, never to believe in partnership, embracing instead a vision of the Sith where only one could rule, unchallenged, absolute. And thus, even in death, Plagueis shaped the philosophy of his apprentice, becoming the silent teacher who reminded Sidious of what not to be, the ghost whose failure defined his student's success. In the years of his reign, Sidious would speak rarely of his master, mentioning him only once in the story told to Anakin Skywalker, the infamous tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, and even then the tale was less an homage than a weapon, a parable crafted to tempt, to seduce, to spark Anakin's fear of loss. But within it lingered the truth that Plagueis had indeed discovered secrets beyond imagining, secrets that haunted the Force itself, and though Sidious dismissed immortality as weakness, the galaxy would never forget the whisper that his master could prevent death and perhaps even create life. In this way, Plagueis lived on as both myth and memory, a cautionary tale and a temptation, his name erased from history yet preserved in whispers, his vision of a Sith dynasty twisted but not entirely lost. For Sidious, though he sought no equal, still built an empire that embodied his master's lesson that the Republic could be strangled, not with armies but with politics, not with swords but with shadows, not with rage but with patience. And so the legacy of Plagueis is written across the very galaxy that Sidious ruled, in the Senate chambers that became hollow puppets, in the corporations that became instruments of tyranny, in the Jedi who fell to blindness not by war, but by manipulation, and in the empire that rose from their ashes, an empire born not only from Sidious' ambition, but from the teachings of a Muun who once believed he could master death. And as you let this part of the story rest within you, imagine the Emperor on his throne, cloaked in black, his voice cold as he commands fleets and armies, and behind him, unseen yet present, the shadow of his master, not as spirit or ghost, but as memory, the faint echo of lessons whispered long ago, a reminder that even in betrayal, even in death, the legacy of a teacher endures, shaping the destiny of galaxies long after his own heartbeat has ceased. The reign of Darth Sidious, though remembered by history as the age of the Emperor, carried within it the fingerprints of Darth Plagueis. For every thread of the grand tapestry of deception that Sidious wove bore traces of lessons first whispered to him by the Muun who had raised him. The manipulation of the Trade Federation, the orchestration of fear through economic dependency, the quiet turning of political allies into slaves of ambition, all these were techniques Plagueis had pioneered, polished, and handed to his apprentice, who then magnified them into instruments of galactic domination. When Sidious engineered the Clone Wars, playing both Republic and Separatists as puppets, he was using the principle that Plagueis had always emphasized, that chaos carefully directed produces opportunity, and that wars fought with soldiers are won long before the first blaster bolt, when credits, debts, and supply lines are already under control. The Senate that applauded Palpatine's rise to Chancellor was already compromised by Plagueis's groundwork, its factions weakened by years of financial manipulation, its reliance on the banking clan making it unable to resist when Sidious exploited those same ties, and in this sense, the Muun's shadow lingered over every vote, every speech, every surrender of power that allowed the Republic to wither into empire. Yet Plagueis' legacy was not only practical, but philosophical, for the cold patience that defined Sidious' path, the ability to wait, to move slowly, to conceal rage beneath layers of charm, was learned at his master's side. In nights when the boy from Naboo had sat listening to the Muun's measured voice, explaining that survival belonged not to those who struck first, but to those who struck last, at the perfect moment. Even Sidious' belief in masks, the art of appearing one thing while being another, was a reflection of Plagueis' own disguise as Hego Damask, the banker who walked openly in the Senate while hiding his nature as a Sith Lord, and though Sidious improved upon the mask, wearing it more completely than any Sith before him, it was still his master who had shown him how to do it. Yet the irony of this legacy was that Sidious both honored and despised it, for he saw in Plagueis the foundation of his empire, but he also saw the flaw that had ended him: the obsession with immortality, the belief that partnership could endure, the blindness to betrayal, and so he carried forward his master's tools while discarding his master's dream, ensuring that the dynasty of two Plagueis had envisioned would never come to pass, ensuring instead that only one Sith himself would ever rule. Still in whispers the Moon's name lingered, for Sidious could never fully erase him, not in memory, not in philosophy, and not in the Force, where the echoes of his experiments continued to ripple. Even when Sidious told the tale of Plagueis to Anakin Skywalker years later, framing it as a parable of tragedy, he was acknowledging the enduring shadow of his master, using the very myth of Plagueis as a lure, turning the old obsession with death into a promise that would tempt the chosen one to darkness. Thus, though he lay cold in his tomb, forgotten by the galaxy at large, Plagueis remained present in every triumph of Sidious, his ghost living not as spirit, but as influence, a silent hand guiding the galaxy long after its owner was gone. And as you let this part of the story drift into your mind, picture the Emperor upon his throne in the Imperial Palace, lightning casting sharp lines across his face, fleets of star destroyers stretching into hyperspace at his command, senators bowing in submission, stormtroopers marching in endless ranks, and behind it all, faint yet unshakable, the shadow of a moon who once whispered of patience, control, and inevitability, the forgotten teacher whose legacy was written not in immortality, but in empire, not in life preserved, but in history remade. His tragedy and his triumph entwined forever in the reign of the apprentice who killed him. There came a night, years after the moon called Darth Plagueis the Wise had perished, when his name surfaced once more in a place no one expected, not in the records of the Senate, nor in the whispers of the Jedi, but in the private chamber of a Coruscant opera house, where music swelled like waves and lights shimmered like distant stars, and there, in the glow of performance, Darth Sidious, cloaked in the guise of Chancellor Palpatine, leaned close to a troubled young Jedi named Anakin Skywalker and told a story framed as myth yet heavy with truth, a story meant not only to be remembered but to tempt. And so the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise passed from history into legend. Palpatine's voice was soft, smooth, filled with the gravity of one sharing a secret long forbidden, and he spoke of a Sith Lord who was so powerful, so wise, that he could use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians to create life, that he had the power to prevent those he loved from dying. And as Anakin listened, his eyes heavy with fear and longing, the seed of temptation took root, for the promise of saving Padme, the promise of defying death itself, was irresistible. Sidious spoke not as a student honoring a master, but as a storyteller crafting a parable, emphasizing the irony that Plagueis could save others, but not himself, that he was betrayed by the very apprentice he had trained. And in that irony, Anakin heard both warning and possibility, not realizing that the very man whispering the tale was the betrayer, that the apprentice was now the Chancellor at his side, spinning the truth into a lure. In this retelling, Plagueis became more than a Muun Sith Lord lost to time. He became a myth of the dark side, an archetype of power and folly. His life condensed into a parable that spoke directly to Anakin's fear of loss, transforming a private obsession into a universal temptation. The Jedi never spoke such stories, for they denied the dark side any acknowledgement. And so to Anakin, who had never heard of Plagueis, the tale carried the weight of revelation. A forbidden knowledge that seemed to open doors the Jedi had barred. And though Sidious did not name his master, though he cloaked the story in vagueness, the effect was deliberate, for mystery made it alluring, myth made it safe to believe, and yet every word was sharpened with intent, each syllable drawing Anakin closer to a choice that would end the Republic itself. Thus, the legacy of Plagueis lived on not in immortality, but in story. His life reduced to a whisper used as bait. His tragedy turned into a key that unlocked the downfall of the Jedi Order. And the irony was bitter that the Sith Lord who had dreamed of eternal life did achieve eternity, but only as a cautionary tale told by the apprentice who killed him. And as you let this chapter rest within you, imagine the opera house glowing with strange lights, alien voices rising in song, the galaxy outside still believing in peace, while inside a young Jedi leans forward, caught by a whisper, and an old Sith Lord smiles, knowing that the myth of Darth Plagueis the Wise has become the final step in the seduction of the Chosen One, the whisper of immortality carrying across the ages, shaping destiny long after the man himself had turned to dust. So the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise comes to its end, though in truth endings are illusions. For while his body perished in a silent chamber at the hands of his apprentice, while his name was erased from the records of the Republic and never carved into the tombs of Korriban, the whisper of him endures, softer than breath yet carried farther than armies, a tale that drifts from master to student, from Sith to Jedi, from myth to memory, changing with each retelling but never fully fading. Because what he sought was not merely power, but the greatest of questions: can death itself be conquered? Can life be preserved beyond its natural span? Can the Force be bent not only to destroy, but to create? And in that question lies a fascination that no generation can ignore. The tragedy is not only that he failed, but that his failure became the very tool by which his apprentice, Darth Sidious, ensnared the Chosen One, the whisper of Plagueis shaping events long after his breath was gone, proving in its own way that he had achieved a kind of immortality, not in flesh but in story, not in body but in the haunting irony of his downfall. To the galaxy at large he is unknown, a shadow lost in time, yet to those who touch the Force his presence lingers, a reminder that knowledge can be as dangerous as any weapon, that wisdom pursued without balance can turn into chains, and that even the most brilliant mind can be undone by the hunger it feeds. His laboratories have long since gone dark, his instruments left to rust, his formulas forgotten in sealed archives, yet the questions he asked still echo in the silence of the Force. And in that echo his legend remains alive, passed on not in chronicles, but in whispers, as a cautionary tale, as a temptation, as a reminder that some truths are too heavy to hold. Perhaps that is why his name endures with the strange weight of myth, because in every listener who hears of him, there is the quiet recognition of the fear he sought to overcome, the fear of loss, the fear of death, the longing to hold on to what must one day pass. And in this way, the whisper of Darth Plagueis belongs not only to the Sith, but to all beings who dream of escaping the final silence. And so was when the stars burn and fade, when empires rise and fall, when even the name of Sidious becomes dust. Still, there will be some quiet retelling of the tragedy, some murmur in the dark of the moon who sought to outwit death, some echo that lingers like the fading note of a song, reminding all who hear it that knowledge is power, power is temptation, and temptation is tragedy. And as you let this final chapter close, imagine the galaxy at rest. Coruscant's towers dimming into night, the Jedi Temple long gone, the Senate chamber silent, and somewhere in the quiet, far away, a single whisper drifts like wind across forgotten stone. The tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, a whisper that never ends.